Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my Best Books of the Year video. This is a video talking about my favorite books from each of the genres that I read this year. I'll be talking about my favorite fantasy books, my favorite sci-fi books, my favorite Star Wars and Star Trek books, my favorite YA books, my favorite legal thrillers and mysteries and all that great stuff. So I have a lot to cover in this video. I will also be doing a video talking about the worst books I read this year and maybe some different tags of favorite characters and relationships and things like that, but that'll be a different video. Today we're focusing on the best books that I read this year. And whoo boy, A, did I read a lot of books, and B, did I read a lot of good books. So narrowing down was a little bit tough here. So it's not always, sometimes it'll be a top 5, sometimes it'll be a top 4, sometimes it'll be a top 3. It just kind of depends on what I wanted to focus on. And there are many more books that could have made this list, but these are the ones that I felt merited being above the others in the fold. So these are the best of the best of the best that I read this year. So why don't we kick it off with sci-fi? I read 19 science fiction books this year. Pretty good. I want to say that's my record for most science fiction novels ever read in a year. Not only did sci-fi as reading kick off for me, but my video top 10 sci-fi books and series really took off for me this year, so a lot of people are finding my sci-fi discussions. But I have 4 books I want to highlight out of the 19. My number 4 best sci-fi book I read this year was Dune, or Sisterhood of Dune by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. A lot of people don't like the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson Dune books, and I understand that. But this book is surprisingly deep. It asks a lot of philosophical questions. It has great action. It has great political thriller elements, which is, I think, the best part of the book. It's also got some good character development and some interesting world building that I really appreciated, and kicks off a terrific trilogy. The whole trilogy is great. So that is my number 4 book of the year for science fiction. For science fiction, my number 3 book of the year is The Chaplain's War by Brad R. Torgerson. This is his debut with Bane, his debut novel. It is a book about a chaplain's assistant who basically gets pulled into a conflict, and he is the only one that this alien species will communicate with because he's friends with one of their scientists. And so when this alien species decides to start exploring Earth's religions to try to understand Earth's faiths in order to try to understand humans. And so this species starts asking him all these questions. And being a chaplain's assistant, he's kind of in a unique place where he kind of knows stuff and also at the same time kind of doesn't. And it is a deep book. There's a little bit of action in the book, some cool action sequences, but there's a lot of discussions and theological discussions that I thought were terrific. So that's my number 3. My number 2 science fiction book of the year is kind of an alternative history book, and that is The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal. This book is about accelerating the space program, and because of that, and because of the different problems that arise because of the space program, we end up needing to add all these women into the space program earlier. And so this is a series called the Lady Astronaut series by Mary Robinette Kowal. And if you like things like For All Mankind, you will absolutely enjoy this book. This is the closest book I've read that gets that For All Mankind feeling, and it's got a great cast of characters. You're following the main character in a first-person narrative, and Mary Robinette includes elements that I don't love being in my science fiction books, some sexual elements, but other than that, it's a terrific book. It has so much great discussions about math, some great discussions about what it was like to be a woman in the in the 50s and 60s. There's a lot of great stuff in here. But my number 1 science fiction book read of the year is an easy answer, and that is Mars by Ben Bova. This is one of the books in his Grand Tour series, and just this book tells science fiction in a way that I absolutely love. It felt like For All Mankind met The Martian. It was humorous, it was riveting, it was epic, it was a hard sci-fi, but with little sequences of more softer sci-fi, and just I think this is a gorgeous cover, gorgeous cover art. And I thought that this book just it catapulted. It's in my top two. I think it's still too early to decide if this is my number one or my number two book, because my number one science fiction book of all time is Manta's Gift by Timothy Zahn. But this is, if it is second place, it's a close second because it is amazing. And I've bought many Ben Bova books, and I intend to read them in 2024. So that's the science fiction books that I read, my top 4 science fiction. Now I'm going to talk about my top 5 fantasy novels. This is, I read a total of 24 fantasy novels in the year 2023. So I read a lot of fantasy, and a lot of them were great. I had a few duds, but a lot of them were great. And so I'm going to talk about the top 5. And really, my top 2 were really close. And actually, there's a tie for one of them, and I'll explain when I get there. But tie for first. But my number 5 best fantasy book I read is The Last Druid by Terry Brooks. I decided that I wanted to just binge through the Shannara books. I had 7 remaining Shannara novels. I had the trilogy, and then I had a tetralogy. The trilogy was The Defenders of Shannara, and I really didn't care for that trilogy. I think it's one of his weakest series. And then there was the Fall of Shannara tetralogy. It was 4 books. And those 4 books, each book got better, and each book was really good, and each book also got longer. And the final book, which is the longest book in this tetralogy, and is also either the second or third longest Shannara book of all time, this novel wraps up the series in a very interesting way. This is not the big, every character from the previous novels comes in and has an epic battle. No, this is, everything from this series is tied up, but we're finishing off themes and moments from other series. We're paying off the emotional ties of the rest of the books. And the final chapter of this book poses some deep questions that I thought were beautifully written. And this is just a beautifully written ending. And I think that Terry Brooks could have been much more controversial, but he was so deft in the way he made it. So this is the final Shannara novel, and it was delightful. So that's my number 5 of the fantasy books I read this year. My number 4 is Tress of the Emerald Sea. This is one of the secret projects by Brandon Sanderson. It's actually my favorite of the secret projects. I loved it so much when I read it. It is, if you're looking for like a Princess Bride style story, this is the closest you'll get. It is, as I mentioned, delightful. I love the magic and world building in this book. It's simple. It's very easy to understand, and it's very entertaining because of that. In fact, I wish he would do this type of magic system more in his other fantasy books. But I loved the character of Tress. I loved her journey that she goes on. I love the cast of characters around her. The narrator, Hoyd, in this book is hilarious. The ending, there are 2 twists at the ending that I thought were really, really good. And I caught one of them and totally didn't catch the other one. So I loved Tress of the Emerald Sea. And it is a good standalone. If you've never read a Cosmere novel, or really just anything Brandon Sanderson, this could be a good starting point, I think. Because there are tie-ins to other Cosmere books, but you don't have to have read those. I think you can get that. So it's a good standalone, and that's my number 4. My number 3 is also another standalone, this time coming from Michael A. Stackpole, one of my favorite authors. I actually met Michael Stackpole last year at a convention and did like a 5-minute interview with him. And then at DragonCon this year, I did a full, I think it was like 15 or 20 minutes, where I talked with Mr. Stackpole, and that's up on the channel. So look up just Michael Stackpole interview, Jonathan Cohn, you'll find the video. And he actually signed my book here, which was really nice, and that is Eyes of Silver. Now, you're probably seeing this cover and thinking, that's a terrible cover. Why would you recommend this book? This looks like a cheesy romance. No. This is a great fantasy that is really a historical fiction masquerading as a fantasy. This book is set in a fantastical world, but each land in this book is, in essence, supposed to be a mirror of a land on Earth, and it's pulling from all of these ancient wars and battles and characters from history. And so if you're a history buff, you'll really enjoy this because you'll see, oh, this is this character from history. And it's not just major main characters from history, it's really more obscure elements of history that he's pulling from. And there is a magic system and a little bit of a magical element, but it's really faint. It's really little. This is, as I mentioned, it really reads more like a historical fiction. And there is a romance element, as you could guess, but it's really good. So that's my number 3. Both Tress and Eyes of Silver made it onto my top fantasy standalones list. So now to my number 2 best fantasy book. I went back and forth really heavily on what I'm going to discuss as my number 2 fantasy book of the year, and my number 1, because they're so close together. So I'm going to give the edge out to the book that I think is going to stick with me longer, and so because of that, I'm going to give the number 2 spot to the one that I don't think is going to stay with me quite as long, but is still terrific, and that is Destiny by Elizabeth Hayden. This is also one of the longest books I read this year. Normally I read a couple books that are close to 1,000 or 1,000 more pages. I didn't do that this year, really. My tomes tended to be in the 700 to 600 page range. This book is about 850 pages. So I know some of you are going to be like, that's not a long book. Yeah, for me it is. It's a little long. Anyway, this was the 3rd book in the Symphony of Ages trilogy. I know that she went on and did more series, but this kind of wraps up this storyline. It was a beautiful ending. It's long, it's a little bit bloated, but when it gets good, there are moments in here that's some of the top tier moments of fantasy for me. And I really think Elizabeth Hayden gets a style of fantasy that works for me so well. I think Elizabeth Hayden just, there was this period of 90s fantasy that just, everything from the Wheel of Time and the Rune Lords and now the Rhapsody series that just is quintessentially fantasy for me. And this book absolutely nails that. And not just the cover art, which is from Royo, which is beautiful, but just as a fantasy novel. And so I really loved this. This is a good, solid romance, good, solid character arcs, good, solid humor and plots and action and payoffs as well. So that's my second favorite fantasy book of the year. So to talk about my top fantasy book of the year, and I mentioned that there was a tie for this position, and it is because it's 2 books from the same series by the same author, both of which were released in 2023. And that would be the Chronicles of Hanuvar series. You have Lord of a Shattered Land, and you have The City of Marble and Blood. Both of these came out in 2023. You had Lord of a Shattered Land came out in August, and City of Marble and Blood came out in October. I'm going to be totally honest, these books were not on my radar to read this year, but I was reached out to by a publisher, the publisher Bain, and they said, hey, can you read these and provide a review? And I said, sure. And I have read a couple of their books, and I've not loved everything that Bain's published this year. I'm not gonna be afraid to admit they've published some books I didn't love, but these 2 books are fantasy on another level. There is no one out there writing fantasy today quite like Howard Andrew Jones. He gets something that fans of classic fantasy want, but in a way that makes it accessible to modern day readers. The way he writes language and the way he writes characters works for modern day readers, while at the same time the tone of the book, the feel of the book is very classic sword and sorcery, very classic fantasy tropes, very classic fantasy set pieces and whatnot. If you didn't know, this is the Chronicles of Hanuvar. Hanuvar is the main character in these books, and it is about basically it's a kind of a what if Hannibal survived the sacking of Carthage and set out to save his people and get his revenge. It's not really revenge focused, but it's kind of revenge focused. And so you're seeing this guy Hanuvar, who's like Hannibal, go and take out and so go and save his people from the Dervan Empire. He can't just go kill everyone in the Dervan Empire. There's no way he'd be able to accomplish it. So instead, he tries to go in, find his people, and escape and get them out to to a new homeland, like a new Carthage. They call it New Volanus, and it is a terrific tale. Both books are told in kind of short story formats, where like each chapter is like 40 or 50 pages long, and that chapter is kind of self-contained, but it also propels the story forward a little bit. And so he's on a journey, and each chapter is moving him on his journey, but it also could work as its own short story. If you read one of these in a fantasy collection, which is where some of them appeared, then it would totally work as just a short story, but it is advancing the story. And so it's some of the most linear short stories I've ever read, but it is a genius book series. And the first book has more monsters focused, and the second book has more soldiers fighting each other focused. And they are both amazing debuts, and it's great to see fantasy thrive like this. So those are my two fantasy. My number one spot goes to these two because it's the same author, same series. I didn't want to give him just one and two, so I'm giving him both because I really do believe they're both solid books. The third book comes out in October. It's already written, and he's working on book 4 now, so I'm very excited about that. Now let's talk about some of the other books I read. Now for YA books this year, I didn't read that many. I only read about 13. And I really only want to focus on one of them. There is one YA book that just absolutely was terrific. And it's actually, the trilogy was great, but I'm going to focus in on the first book of this trilogy, which was phenomenal. And that is Partials by Dan Wells. The whole trilogy is great, is fantastic. But this book, the first book, is on another level in terms of writing. Dan Wells is one of my favorite authors now. His I Am Not a Serial Killer series is fantastic. His standalone novels like Ghost Station are great, and Extreme Makeover is horrifying. Man, he's messed up. And this is a YA series. Boy, is it YA, and it's dystopian, but it's kind of more with a scientific bent. The characters are all kind of working with scientists. It's really exploring these dark, deep themes. This is a branch of YA. Like, I have kids in my 6th grade class that read YA, and a few in my 5th grade class too, but I have kids in my 6th grade class who read YA books. I would not let 6th graders read this. Not because the story is, like, explicit in anything, but because it's dark, and it's dealing with deeper themes. And, it's something that it's truly made for, like, 16 or 17-year-olds. That being said, it is entertaining through and through. It's got an amazing twist. I mean, an amazing twist in this book that I don't want to spoil. So that's my best YA book of the year. Now, I'm going to lump together legal thriller and mystery because I have 11 books in that category, and that was a very solid category that I read, and I'm going to talk about the top 3 from that category. But that was a solid category where I liked or loved just about everything. But my number 3 in my legal thriller and mystery series book reads is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. This is an Agatha Christie mystery. This is a mystery that I inadvertently called. I was talking with a coworker and said, "Oh, wouldn't it be funny if this was the if this was the twist?" And they said, "Yeah, that would be an interesting twist." And I was totally joking because I was like, "There's no way Agatha Christie's gonna pull that off as the twist." And I was at the beginning of the book when I said that, and then she does it. And it was brilliant. That was a brilliant twist. I was like, I saw it coming and didn't see it coming because I thought there was no way she could pull that off. And she does. And it's genius. So that was my number 3. My number 2 is a book that has become one of my favorite Agatha Christie books, and that is Sparkling Cyanide. This was a book where the mystery was totally unexpected, but as soon as the mystery started, I remembered all the clues. I saw every clue. The second she starts unveiling the mystery, in my brain, it's like I was teleported back to the early parts of the book, and I was like, oh, that detail makes sense. Oh, that detail makes sense. Oh, that detail. Like, all the details were there. It was all, the setup was all there. You could totally see it. And I want to reread this one particularly because I think I'd pick up on things so much faster. Sometimes like they don't the author will withhold information from you to try to convince you to try to trick you or to make the twist better. Oh, and all of a sudden the person has a sister. Oh, and all of a sudden no, there's this new evidence. No, everything from the beginning portion of the book, the evidence is there. You just have to put the pieces together, and you don't know what's actually evidence and what's not evidence. Oh, this was a genius twist. So that's my favorite Agatha Christie book, but it's my second in this category. The first book in this category for legal thriller and mystery is a legal thriller by John Grisham. It's one of the first books I read this year, as is Sparkling Cyanide. I started the year off really in good form. And that is the book The Litigators by John Grisham. This has become one of my favorite John Grisham novels. It is a way... I like the way he writes the main protagonist in this book, because so often John Grisham writes legal thrillers and everyone's terrible, even the main protagonist. And I'm like, I can't root for them when you're such awful, terrible people. But this book, the protagonist's a good guy, and he ends up becoming a better guy as the book goes down the line. Some guys, they start out good and they become bad in his books. This time the guy's good and he becomes great by the end of the book. I loved the main character. He was really touching. I thought that the two lawyers that he works with were just so funny. I thought they were a humorous duo. I thought that the situations that they were in constantly, I thought the bar sequences in this book were hilarious. I thought that the trial sequences were really interesting. And the heart that this book has, the way it's able to be a funny book and also just a heart-wrenching book at the same time, shows that John Grisham's a good author. If he turned in more books like The Litigators, and I'm sure there are probably more, I would love it. His other books I read this year were good, but they didn't catapult into favorites of all time, like The Litigators. So now, my next category is Star Trek, where I read 22 Star Trek books this year. Star Trek is a series that I have ups and downs with. There are some years where I'm just reading banger after banger for Star Trek, and then there's some years it's like, why am I reading the Star Trek books? They're taking forever, and it's not paying off. Sometimes it feels like that. But this year, I did have a few great Star Trek books to read. And so I'll start with I'll talk about my top 5 here out of the 22. So my number 5 is the Strange New Worlds kickoff novel, The High Country by John Jackson Miller. This is the kickoff, the lead-off for the Strange New Worlds novel line. And, of course, John Jackson Miller is a terrific author. This book, it has a great kind of a Western theme to it. It's got great action. This is one of his longer books in terms of word count, and I thought it was just really entertaining. It's not his best book by any means, and it's not the best book I read of Star Trek this year, but it was a good book. I could say it was the best book released this year for Star Trek because there were only 2 books released for Star Trek. Grr. But it was a great book. My number 4 Star Trek read of the year was Child of Two Worlds by Greg Cox, who is also quickly becoming a favorite Star Trek author of mine. This book is a Spock-focused book, but it also has Pike as a main character. So it's kind of like it's in Strange New Worlds, but when this book was written, there was no Strange New Worlds series. But it's really, this book explores, of course, Spock's personality, but there's also another character that Child of Two Worlds kind of applies to. And so this is a fun little adventure if you enjoy the not only the TOS crew, but the pre-TOS crew, the Pike era crew. Now for my number 3 best Star Trek book. Now we're getting into upper echelons of Star Trek books this year. I have Force and Motion by Jeffrey Lang, one of the Star Trek Deep Space Nine books. This book had no business being amazing. This should have been just a little, oh, that's a fun adventure, throw it aside. This book is entertaining from cover to cover. I read it so fast. I loved it. I was like, this should be just like, this is featuring Rom and O'Brien. Who wants a novel of Ramen O'Brien going to visit a friend of O'Brien's that you've like heard about before? Like, who wants that novel? Well, apparently, I didn't know I wanted it. It's not the book I want, but it's the book I need because it's so good, and it's a great story, a great adventure, and a great cover. Oh, that's a great cover. But oh, it's a good book, and it's a standalone. Really, it really doesn't require you to have read much of the post-Nemesis universe, even though it's set in the post-Nemesis universe. You'll pick up the clues well. So if you want an excellent novel, this is really good. DS9 was firing on all cylinders this year because I have another DS9 book to talk about in a minute. But first, my number 2 Star Trek book is Star Trek Generations by J.M. Dillard. This is the novelization of the movie Generations, with the story, I have to look at this, the story by Rick Berman, Ronald D. Moore, and Brandon Braga, and then the screenplays by Ronald D. Moore and Brandon Braga. It is funny how uneven J.M. Dillard is with her novelizations, because the novelization of Undiscovered Country is a top-tier novelization. The novelization of The Final Frontier is an okay novelization. And then I think her novelization of First Contact is a bad novelization. So she has like an amazing top-tier one, a good one, and a bad one. Boy, is she all over the place. And so I wasn't sure with Generations, but oh, it's so good. What makes this book so good is it adds a ton of context, particularly to the TOS characters. I am a TOS movie era person. I always recommend, if people ask me all the time, how do I get into Star Trek? I've never watched Star Trek. I say watch the TOS movies and the TNG show. Those are the two that I think work best for everyone. I think TOS, the show, will feel too goofy at times and also feels it is, I think, more difficult for new fans to get into. I know TOS is like the sacred show for everyone, but TOS I think is hard for people who have never watched Star Trek to get into. But I think the TOS movies are really more commercial and more easy to get people into. So I recommend the TOS movies. So the movie era is really close to my heart, and this book, I'm gonna have to spoil it because y'all know the big thing about Generations is the Kirk dies, and in the movie he kind of dies twice, and it's the first time is so unceremonious, and the first time it's not given justice, and in the book they give it justice. They give a lot of context to what he was doing pre-death. They give a lot of context to how it affected everyone. The scenes of McCoy and Spock grieving, the scenes of them calling the other characters to let them know, to warn them that hey, he's died and we're having the funeral and all this stuff. Oh, it was so good, so heart-wrenching. And so Generations is my number 2. My number 1 Star Trek book of the year was a recent read, and it was so good, and that is The Missing by Una McCormick. This is a Deep Space Nine novel. Again, Deep Space Nine has no business being this good. I'm going to move these because it's going to fall eventually. Deep Space Nine has no business being this good. But this is a DS9 story that is really short. It's only about 300 pages. But I do not think I've ever seen a Star Trek novel cram so much plot, character development, themes, and other stuff just into a short book. I mean, this book is chock full of everything. You get a great storyline about a bunch of characters in here. So this book is just brilliant on every level. And Una McCormick is shooting up my favorite Star Trek authors list. So that is my number 1 Star Trek book. And now for my Star Wars books of the year, top Star Wars books. I'm going to talk about 3. I read 27 Star Wars books, so I have a lot I could talk about. And you're like, wait a second, some of these other categories, you have 4 or 5. Why are you only doing 3 for Star Wars? I'm doing the 3 for Star Wars that stand above the rest, because they're really in a different field from the rest. There's some bad Star Wars books, there's some mediocre books, there's a lot in the good to great category, and then I have 3 in the amazing top tier Star Wars books category. And so I'm talking about those 3. So my number 3 best books of the Star Wars books of the year is actually the one I read most recently, and that is Ascension by Christy Golden. I have been reading the Fate of the Jedi series all of the second half of the year. I am, as this video records, I am done. As this video comes out, I'm done with the series. I am about to read book 9, the final book by Troy Denning, Apocalypse. So maybe that book will be the best, but this book is like head and shoulders above the rest. I'd say all the rest are in the 4 to 4.5 out of 5 category, where they're all either good or great, but they're not the best Star Wars I've ever read. And then all of a sudden, Ascension comes out of nowhere, and Christy Golden just packs in the best political storyline, the best Jedi versus Sith storyline, the best romance of the series, and it just is so elevated compared to the rest of the books. And I'm like, where was this in the other books? This is the pinnacle of the Fate of the Jedi series for me as a reader. And I still have to read the finale. But as a penultimate book, this was amazing. And I can't gush about this enough. So that's my number 3 best Star Wars book of the year. My number 2 best Star Wars book of the year is one of the High Republic releases. High Republic has been dominating the publishing line, and it's been all over the place. But when it hits, sometimes it can hit. And Eye of Darkness by George Mann was a delightful book. This is a darker book than you're normally getting in the High Republic because the villains are winning right now. And this book has a sequence that is one of my favorite visual sequences in all of Star Wars, and it's not a visual, it's in a book, so you're not seeing like a painting or an image on the screen, but it's seared into my mind because George Mann is such a good visual author. By the way, there's some cool moments in Ascension too that are freaky, but The Eye of Darkness really explores what it's like when the Jedi are on their heels and are a little bit scared, and this book is kind of like if you know how Infinity War, you have our heroes versus the villain, but the villain is basically the protagonist of the story because he gets the most screen time and he is the attention of the story. They're all reacting to him. That's what the Eye of Darkness is. All our Jedi main characters are still points of view characters, but the real main character of this book is Marchion Ro, who is just terrific in this book. Now, for my number 1 Star Wars book of the year, it was my most anticipated release this year, and it is also the book that I think is of the Star Wars books by far the best, and that is Inquisitor: Rise of the Red Blade. This book is by Delilah Dawson, one of my favorite Star Wars authors. Really, she's a great author in general. Her non-Star Wars books are pretty good too. Some of them aren't. But this book takes place between episode 2 and episode 3, goes a little bit past episode 3, and if you enjoy the Revenge of the Sith because you like the overall storytelling structure, you like the falling from grace, you like the turn to the dark side stuff, you're going to love this book because you see this character go from being a Jedi to being kind of disillusioned with the Jedi to becoming an Inquisitor by the end of the book. And it is a beautiful book. It deals with a lot of deeper themes. It has great visceral writing that only Delilah Dawson can deliver, and it's just terrific. So that is my number 1 Star Wars book of the year. So those are my books of the year. There's a lot of them I talked about. If you stayed with me for the whole video, thank you so much. But let me know what your favorite books reads of the year, and if you've read any of these, did you enjoy them or not enjoy them? Let me know that stuff as well. But until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.